There is a coin in a glass case in a museum in Montana that nobody can explain. It is an ordinary silver dollar, the kind that jangled in 1,000 pockets across the frontier in the year 1876. But this one has a notch filed into its edge, a single deliberate cut, as if someone wanted it to be recognized among 100 others just like it. Beside it, under glass, sits a yellowed ledger page from a mercantile that burned down over a century ago. On that page, in faded ink, is a single line, paid in full $3 by a stranger who would not give his name. For decades, the story attached to that coin was told wrong. People said a rich cattle baron paid off a poor widow's debt out of Christian charity, and that was the end of it. A nice, forgettable footnote. They were wrong about almost everything. The man who paid those $3 was not rich. He was not a stranger to the woman he saved. And he was not, by the reckoning of the law and the newspapers of his day, a good man at all. He was a killer, a man with blood on his hands and a bounty on his head. And the woman he saved that day was married to the one man on this earth he had sworn, in his coldest and quietest moments, that he would never lift a finger to help, because that man had destroyed his life. The town of Redemption Creek did not so much welcome strangers as tolerate them. The way a dog tolerates a fly it is too tired to snap at. It sat in a fold of the Montana foothills where the grass turned gold in September and the wind never stopped complaining about something. There was one main street. Packed dirt turned to a ribbon of dust in summer and a ribbon of mud in spring, lined with a mercantile, a bank, a saloon with a piano that was perpetually one key short of in tune, a church with a bell that rang crooked, and a scattering of clapboard houses that leaned into the wind like they were listening for gossip. On the morning this story begins, a rider came down out of the hills to the west, and every soul on that street found a reason to stop what they were doing and watch him pass. He was a big man, not tall so much as built, the way a barn is built, with shoulders that filled out a worn leather vest and forearms roped with muscle from years of hard living. His hair was dark and curled past his collar, wild from the wind and the road, and he wore it like a man who had long since stopped caring what anyone thought of it. He rode a black horse with a coat like coal smoke, and he rode it the way men only ride when they have spent more nights sleeping under stars than under roofs. His name was Boone Larkin, and in 3 territories that name meant one thing. Trouble had a face, and this was it. He was not an outlaw in the way the dime novels like to paint outlaws: no black hat, no swagger, no pistols fanned out for show. Boone Larkin had never robbed a bank or held up a stagecoach in his life. What he was worse. In the quiet way that respectable people find worse, he was a man who had killed other men for money. Not many. 4, to be exact, and every one of them had needed killing by the law's own reckoning bounties. All of them. Paper posted by marshals in 3 counties for men who had done things that made killing look almost like mercy. But 4 killings, however justified, leave a mark on a man's face that towns can read from half a mile off. And Redemption Creek read Boone Larkin the moment his horse's shadow fell across the first porch on Main Street. Doors did not slam. Nobody ran. That was not how it worked in a town like this. Instead, conversations simply thinned out, the way water thins when you pour it over a wider surface. Mrs. Abernathy, sweeping her porch, found something more interesting to sweep at her feet than to watch the road. The blacksmith's hammer found a slower rhythm. 2 boys playing marbles in the dirt went still and wide-eyed, the way boys do when they sense a story walking past that they will tell their own children someday. Boone noticed none of it, or if he did, he had long since trained his face not to show it. He had ridden into 100 towns like this one. He knew the silence that followed him the way a sailor knows a particular current, not comfortable, but familiar enough not to fight. He was not here for trouble. He told himself that plainly, the way he told himself most things these days, flatly, without much conviction, because conviction was a thing he had misplaced somewhere on the trail a few years back and had never quite managed to find again. He was here because his horse needed shoeing, because his stores were down to coffee grounds and jerky gone hard as shoe leather, and because a man passing through the Montana Territory eventually has to stop being a shadow on the horizon and become, for an hour or two, a man standing in a store buying flour like anybody else. He did not know, as he swung down off his horse in front of the livery, that Redemption Creek was the one town in 4 territories he had spent 6 years actively avoiding. He did not know that the man who owned the largest ranch outside of town, a spread called Hargrove Crossing, 40,000 acres of good grass and better water, was a man named Elias Hargrove. The same Elias Hargrove who, 7 years before, had stood up in a courtroom in Bannock and, with his hand on a Bible, told a jury a lie so complete and so devastating that it had cost Boone Larkin everything he owned, everyone he loved, and any claim he might once have made to being an honest man. Boone tied his horse to the rail outside the livery and walked toward the mercantile, unaware that in less than an hour, his past and his future were both going to walk out that same door, wearing the same worn blue dress, carrying the same empty coin purse. Before we go further, it's worth spending a moment on Redemption Creek itself, because a town, like a person, has its own history. And that history shapes what happens inside its borders as surely as any single character does. The town had been founded 11 years earlier by a small party of prospectors who'd found modest but reliable placer gold in the creek that gave the settlement its name, and who had, in a fit of optimism common to frontier founders, chosen the name partly for the creek's clear, redeeming waters, and partly, the story went, because the party's leader, a former preacher turned prospector named Amos Red, had wanted his settlement to be a place where a man's past did not have to define his future. It was, by 1876, a reasonably comfortable irony that the town founded on that particular philosophy had, in the years since, produced a self-appointed magistrate who made a comfortable living doing precisely the opposite, using men's pasts, their debts, their misfortunes, as levers to pry loose whatever he wanted from their futures. The gold had largely played out within the first 3 years, as placer gold usually does, and the town that remained had settled into the steadier, less glamorous rhythm of a ranching and farming community: cattle, wheat, a modest trade in furs come winter, and the particular, hard-won stability of a place that had learned, the hard way, that a settlement built on a single vein of luck eventually has to find something more durable to stand on. That transition had not been easy, and more than one family who had come chasing gold had left disappointed, but the ones who stayed, the Abernathys, the Turlows, eventually the Hargroves, who had bought their 40,000 acres from a departing prospector at a price that seemed a fortune at the time, and a bargain within 5 years had built, out of that harder, steadier ground, a town with genuine character, suspicious of strangers as most frontier towns were, but also, underneath that suspicion, possessed of a stubborn, homegrown sense of fairness that would, in the end, prove decisive in the reckoning still to come for Silas Crenshaw. It is worth remembering, as this story unfolds, that Boone Larkin did not simply win over one woman and one husband. He rode, without quite intending to, into the one town in the territory whose entire founding philosophy, however imperfectly it had been living up to it, lately held that a man's past did not have to be the last word on who he was allowed to become. In a strange, unspoken way, Redemption Creek turned out to be exactly the right place for this particular story to happen. The Redemption Creek Mercantile was owned and operated by a man named Hollis Pruitt, a narrow, sharp-nosed fellow who ran his ledgers with the precision of a man who loved numbers considerably more than he loved people. But Pruitt was not, on this particular morning, the man causing the trouble at the counter. That honor belonged to Judge Silas Crenshaw. Crenshaw was not, strictly speaking, a judge of any court recognized by the Montana Territory. He had appointed himself circuit magistrate for Redemption Creek and 3 surrounding settlements some years back. In the lawless gap after the war, when territories were hungry for any man willing to wear the title, and nobody had ever quite gotten around to correcting the arrangement. He was a heavy-set man with mutton chop whiskers and a gold watch chain he consulted with tiresome regularity, as if his time were worth more than anyone else's in the room, which, in Redemption Creek, it more or less was, because Silas Crenshaw also happened to hold the paper on half the debts in town. And on this Tuesday morning he was standing in the middle of the mercantile, watch chain glinting, informing a young woman in a faded blue dress that she owed him $3, and that if she could not produce it, the law, his law, had a remedy for that. Her name was Abigail Hargrove. She was 26 years old, with hair the color of wheat, pulled back in a practical braid, and hands that had clearly done more hard work in the last year than they had in the 25 before it. She stood very straight, the way people stand when they are trying not to let a room see them shake. "Mr. Crenshaw," she said, "my husband will settle the account the moment he returns. He has done business with this store for 6 years, and never once your husband," Crenshaw said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse, "has been gone for 4 months. Mrs. Hargrove, nobody in this town has had word of him since March. I extended you credit on his good name, and his good name has been conspicuously absent." He consulted his watch, as though the discussion itself were an expense he resented. $3 for flour, salt, and thread is a small sum, I grant you. But a debt unpaid is a debt unpaid, and the law does not discriminate by size. A small crowd had gathered the way crowds do in small towns, not rushing in, but drifting, the way leaves drift toward a drain. Each person telling themselves they had simply come in for tobacco or a spool of ribbon and just happened to be standing there when the trouble started. "I have nothing to offer you today," Abigail said, and her voice had begun, very slightly, to fray at the edges. "I will have it by the end of the month. The wool will sell the end of the month," Crenshaw repeated, as if tasting the phrase and finding it wanting. "Mrs. Hargrove, I have been more than patient, but I have my own obligations, and a business cannot run on the promise of wool." He let that sit a moment, savoring the small theater of it. There is, of course, a customary remedy in cases such as this. A period of indenture labor performed at the debtor's home, applied against the balance, until the account is squared. Mrs. Pruitt has expressed a need for household help. $3 worth of scrubbing floors would hardly take a fortnight. There was a shift in the room, not quite a gasp, because Redemption Creek was not a town given to gasping, but a stillness that was its own kind of sound. Indenture for debt was a thing that happened, technically, on the frontier's ragged legal edges, in the gap where real law hadn't yet caught up to the territories. It was rare. It was ugly, and it was, everyone in that mercantile understood, being proposed now not because $3 mattered to a man as wealthy as Silas Crenshaw, but because Silas Crenshaw had wanted Hargrove Crossing's water rights for 2 years, and Elias Hargrove had refused to sell them. And here, at last, was a lever. Abigail's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "I would rather starve," she said quietly, "than scrub Mrs. Pruitt's floors on your terms, Mr. Crenshaw. That," Crenshaw said, snapping his watch closed, "is certainly your privilege, Mrs. Hargrove. I'll return Thursday for your decision." And it was at that exact moment, as Crenshaw turned toward the door, as Abigail stood alone at the counter with her empty coin purse in her straight back and her eyes bright with a fury she would not let fall as tears that the mercantile door opened again, and Boone Larkin walked in to buy flour, coffee, and horseshoe nails, and stopped 3 steps inside the threshold, because he had just realized whose wife was standing at that counter. Boone Larkin had spent 7 years building a wall around a particular memory, and that wall came down in the time it took Abigail Hargrove to turn her head and notice him standing in the doorway. He did not recognize her right away. He had met the new bride of Elias Hargrove only once, briefly, at a distance. Years before any of this, when Boone still had a ranch of his own and a name that meant something other than trouble. But he recognized the surname the way a man recognizes his own scar tissue, by feel more than sight, in the half-second before Pruitt behind the counter said, "Lo," to a customer near him. Poor Hargrove woman. Crenshaw's had his eye on that water for 2 years now. Hargrove, the word landed in Boone's chest like a dropped stone. 7 years ago, Boone Larkin had owned a modest but honest spread 40 miles south of here, in the Bannock country good grass, a decent herd, a wife named Ellen who sang while she worked, and a boy not yet 3 years old who liked to chase the barn cats. He had also owned, back then, a friendship with a rancher 2 valleys over named Elias Hargrove, a friendship built over 5 years of shared branding seasons and borrowed tools and long evenings on each other's porches, talking about a future that seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable to want. Then came the winter that broke everything. A rustling ring had been working the valley, stealing cattle and running them north to sell across the line. Men were losing their herds, their livelihoods, in some cases their lives. A rancher named Otis Dunmore had been shot dead defending his stock, and the territory, hungry for someone to hang for it, had gone looking for a name to attach to the crime. Boone's name got attached. He still did not fully understand, even now, 7 years later, how it had happened, whether it was a genuine mistake, a case of wrong men seen at a wrong distance, in wrong light, or something more deliberate. What he understood, with perfect and permanent clarity, was that when the circuit court convened and needed a witness to place him at the scene of Dunmore's killing, it was Elias Hargrove, his friend, his neighbor, a man who had eaten at his table more times than Boone could count, who stood up, put his hand on a Bible, and swore under oath that he had seen Boone Larkin riding away from the Dunmore spread on the night of the killing, driving stolen cattle north. It was a lie. Boone knew it was a lie because he had been 40 miles away that night, alone in his own barn, delivering a breech calf that had nearly killed the cow and had certainly ruined any sleep he might have gotten. He had no witness to that fact. A man alone with a laboring cow at 3 in the morning rarely does, and against Elias Hargrove's sworn testimony, that absence of proof became, in the eyes of a frightened and vengeful territory, proof enough. He was never formally convicted. A lack of hard evidence saw to that, eventually, after 8 months in a territorial jail that had felt considerably longer. But 8 months was enough. Enough for the bank to seize his ranch for unpaid debts he'd had no way to service from behind bars. Enough for the fever that swept through the county, that spring of fever he was not there to help fight. Not there to nurse anyone through, to take his wife Ellen and his son Caleb both, within 4 days of each other, while Boone sat in a cell 40 miles away, reading letters that arrived too late to matter. By the time he walked out of that jail a free but ruined man, he had no ranch, no wife, no son, and no friend. What he had, instead, was a fury so complete it had reorganized his entire soul around it, and a single name he had promised himself, in the depths of that grief, he would never forgive: Elias Hargrove. He had not killed Hargrove. He had thought about it, God help him. There had been nights on the trail, sleepless and raw, when he had turned the idea over like a coin, feeling its weight, wondering what it would cost him to spend it. But something in him, some last unburned thread of the man he used to be, had held him back. Instead, he had drifted, taken work where he found it, and found that the frontier had ample use for a man who was good with a gun, and had stopped particularly caring what happened to him. Bounty work. 4 men, over 6 years, all of them wanted dead or alive for crimes that made the killing feel less like sin and more like subtraction. He had told himself that was different from what Hargrove had done to him. He was still not entirely sure he believed it. And now here he stood, in a mercantile in a town he had never once intended to visit, watching Hargrove's wife stand alone at a counter with an empty coin purse and a debt collector's threat still hanging in the air, and every instinct that 7 years of grief and fury had carved into him screamed the same single, ugly, satisfying thought: good. Let the Hargrove name suffer, the way mine did. He almost turned around and walked back out the door. His hand was actually on the frame, the wood cool and rough under his palm, when Abigail Hargrove, not knowing who he was, not knowing what her husband's testimony had cost this stranger, seeing only a big, rough-looking man standing frozen in the doorway, looked at him with the particular, unguarded exhaustion of a person who has just been humiliated in public and has nothing left to hide it with, and said quietly, "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to block the door," and stepped aside to let him pass. It was such a small, ordinary kindness and apology she didn't owe, offered to a stranger who had done nothing but stand there, that it cracked something in Boone Larkin that 7 years of hatred had not managed to touch. The town had its own memory of Boone Larkin's face, though nobody in the mercantile that morning could yet say where they'd seen it. It would come to them later, in scattered pieces, the way recognition often does in small towns. A peddler passing through would mention a bounty man up in the Musselshell country who'd brought in the Coyle brothers dead across their own saddles. A drover would recall a newspaper notice, curling in yellow, tacked to a wall in a Bozeman saloon, describing a large, dark-haired man, formerly of the Bannock country, known to work as an independent bounty hunter. None of it painted a full picture. All of it painted a dangerous one. What the town did not know, what only Boone himself carried, folded away somewhere behind his ribs, where even he did not often look at it directly, was that every single one of the 4 men whose deaths had built that reputation had died for reasons Boone could still recite without hesitation, the way a man recites a debt he intends never to forget he owes. There had been Amos Ruiz, wanted for the murder of a Cheyenne family near the Yellowstone, 3 children among the dead. There had been the Coyle brothers, who had burned a homestead with a family still inside it, rather than let a witness live to name them. There had been a 4th man, whose name Boone did not say aloud even to himself if he could help it, because that killing, unlike the others, had come close enough to the edge of the law's blessing that Boone had spent more nights than he cared to count wondering whether justice and vengeance had, in that instance, worn each other's clothes. He had never killed a man who had not, by his own understanding of the world, deserved it. That understanding had cost him plenty sleep, mostly, and any remaining claim to being the gentle rancher he had once been. But it had also kept him, through 7 hard years, from becoming the kind of man the dime novels like to write about, the kind who killed simply because killing had become easy. He held on to that distinction the way a drowning man holds on to driftwood. It was not much, but it was something to keep his head above water with. Boone did not decide to help her. That was the strange truth of it, the thing he would turn over in his mind for weeks afterward without ever quite resolving it. There was no clean moment of choice, no noble speech he gave himself inside his own head. There was only the fact that his feet, instead of carrying him to the counter to buy his flour and coffee and be on his way, carried him instead toward Hollis Pruitt, and his voice, when it came out, surprised him as much as anyone. "The Hargrove account," he said low, to Pruitt, while Abigail had stepped toward the back of the store to collect herself, her back to the counter, her shoulders set in the careful stillness of a woman refusing to cry in public. The $3. I'll settle it. Pruitt blinked at him. Pruitt, like everyone else in Redemption Creek, had already placed this stranger's face somewhere in the category of men you did not ask unnecessary questions of. You know the family? No, Boone said, which was, in the narrowest technical sense, true. He did not know this woman. He knew her husband, or had once, a lifetime ago, before that man's testimony had buried everything Boone had ever loved. Don't put my name on it. She asks, you tell her it was settled. That's all. Pruitt hesitated a moment. $3 was $3. And he was not a man inclined to question free money, then nodded, opened his ledger, and made the entry Boone would later see reproduced, under glass, in a museum that would not exist for another 130 years, paid in full $3 by a stranger who would not give his name. Boone set $3 silver on the counter. One of them he would not remember doing this until much later, turning the moment over in his memory like a man checking his own pockets for something he'd forgotten he was carrying, had a small notch filed into its edge, a habit he'd picked up years back of marking coins he meant to keep separate from the rest, though he could no longer have said, in that moment, what this particular coin had been meant to be kept separate for. He bought his flour and his coffee and his horseshoe nails in the next 3 minutes, paying for them with entirely different coins, and walked out of the mercantile without once looking toward the woman standing near the back shelves, and without once letting himself examine too closely what he had just done, or why, or what it meant that some buried, stubborn part of him had apparently decided, without consulting the rest of him, that Elias Hargrove's wife did not deserve to pay for her husband's sins. It's not for him, he told himself, swinging back up onto his horse outside the livery a few minutes later, the black gelding shifting under him, eager to be moving. It's for her. She didn't lie under oath. She didn't cost me anything. It was a good thought, a clean, defensible thought. He rode out of town on it, back toward the hills, and told himself the matter was closed. He did not yet know that he had just done something that Redemption Creek, a town built, like most frontier towns, on the sturdy foundation of everybody knowing everybody else's business within about 6 hours, was not going to let stay closed for very long. Abigail found out about the debt within the hour, when she returned to the counter to ask Pruitt, with as much dignity as she could muster, what arrangement he required for payment on account, and Pruitt, a man who genuinely believed he was delivering good news, told her cheerfully that the account had already been settled, in full, by a stranger who'd asked that his name not be given. For a moment, standing in the mercantile, with the afternoon light slanting gold through the front windows, Abigail Hargrove felt something she had not let herself feel in 4 months, hope, small and unfamiliar, like a muscle gone slack from disuse. Who? She asked. Mr. Pruitt, who was it? Big fellow, Pruitt said, already turning back to his ledger, a man for whom the transaction was closed and the mystery someone else's business entirely. Long dark hair. Rode in from the west this morning. Never got a name, didn't seem inclined to give one. Did you know him? Had you seen him before? Pruitt shook his head. Stranger to me. Paid in silver dollars. He paused, frowning slightly, the way a man frowns when a small detail snags on his memory without quite explaining why. One of them had a notch cut in the edge. Odd thing to notice, I suppose, but you don't see that often. Abigail did not know, standing there, that this small detail, a filed notch on a silver dollar, was about to become the single thread that would unravel the whole tangled history, sitting quietly beneath Redemption Creek's dust and gossip. She thanked Pruitt, gathered her flour and salt and thread, and walked home to the small house she had been keeping alone for 4 months, turning the mystery over and over the way a person turns over any unexpected kindness, testing it for the shape of an explanation. Word travels in a small town the way water travels downhill, without effort, without exception, finding every low place it can reach. By supper time, half of Redemption Creek knew that the Hargrove debt had been settled by an unnamed stranger on a black horse, and by the following morning, the other half knew it too, along with several competing theories about who he might have been and why he might have done it. Mrs. Abernathy was certain it was a secret admirer. Abigail Hargrove was, after all, a handsome young woman left alone, and men did foolish, romantic things for handsome young women left alone. The blacksmith thought it more likely to have been a friend of Elias's from his cattle-driving days, come through and heard of the family's trouble, too proud or too shy to make himself known. Old Zeb Turlow, who ran the livery and had actually stabled the stranger's black horse for a few hours that morning, offered the detail that stuck longest and traveled farthest, that the stranger had ridden a horse shod in the Wyoming style, that his saddle showed the wear of a man who lived on it more than off it, and that when Zeb had asked, making conversation, where he was headed, the man had said only, "Wherever the road goes," in a voice Zeb described afterward as not unfriendly, but not a voice you'd ask twice. None of it added up to a name. But it added up slowly, over the following days, to the shape of a man who did not want to be known, doing a kindness he did not want credited, for a woman he claimed no connection to. And that shape, vague as it was, worked on Abigail Hargrove's mind the way an unanswered letter works on a person who is waiting for news. She could not stop turning it over, could not stop wondering, could not entirely let it go. She did not know that the man in question was, at that very moment 40 miles up into the foothills, sitting alone at a cold campfire he had not bothered to light, staring at the darkening sky and asking himself the exact same question she was asking about him, "Why did I do that?" and arriving, as she was, at no answer that satisfied him. Boone told himself he was not coming back for her. He told himself, as he rode down out of the foothills 11 days later, that he needed supplies again, which was true, in the narrow sense that a man on the trail always needs supplies eventually, and that Redemption Creek simply happened to be the nearest town, which was also true, in the narrow sense that there was, in fact, no other town within 2 days' ride in any direction. Both of these things were true, and neither of them was the real reason, and Boone Larkin, riding down the same dusty street he'd ridden up 11 days before, knew it perfectly well and chose not to examine it too closely, the way a man chooses not to examine a wound he suspects is worse than he wants it to be. What he found, when he reached the edge of town, was Abigail Hargrove on her knees beside a well a quarter-mile short of her own gate, wrestling with a bucket that had come loose from its rope and dropped, along with several feet of good hemp line, down into the dark. She did not hear him approach. The wind was up, and she was fully occupied cursing, in the careful, church-going way of a woman who has learned to swear without actually swearing, at a length of rope that would not do what she needed it to do. Boone swung down off his horse without a word, walked to the well, and without asking permission, took the coiled spare rope hanging from his saddle, tied a hook fashioned from a bent horseshoe nail to its end, and lowered it down after the bucket, while Abigail stood back, startled, wiping dust from her hands. "You," she said, after a moment, studying him with the particular attention of a woman assembling a description she intends to remember. "You're the one who paid Mr. Crenshaw's account." Boone did not look up from the well. "Don't know what you mean, ma'am. You rode a black horse, long hair." Pruitt described you well enough, and Zeb Turlow filled in the rest. She folded her arms. "I don't suppose you'd tell me your name." "Bucket's about to come free," Boone said, which was true and also not an answer, and he hauled the dripping bucket up out of the dark water and set it on the well's stone lip with a solidity that suggested the conversation, as far as he was concerned, could end there. It did not end there, because Abigail Hargrove was not a woman inclined to let a mystery walk away from her without at least attempting to catch its coattails. "I owe you $3, she said. "I intend to repay it once I've sold this season's wool, but I would at least like to know whose name to put on the account in my own ledger, if not the merchant's. Something in the plain, stubborn dignity of that request my own ledger, as if she kept a private accounting of every debt she owed the world and intended to square every one of them. However long it took, moved through Boone in a way he did not have a ready name for. "Larkin," he said, before he'd quite decided to say it. "Boone Larkin." He watched her face for the flicker of recognition. He half expected his name had traveled through enough territories that it was not, strictly speaking, an unknown one, but Abigail Hargrove's face showed nothing but polite attention, the look of a person filing away a new name with no particular history attached to it. She had married into the Hargrove ranch only 3 years before, had come from a family in the Dakota Territory with no connection to the old rustling trouble in the Bannock country, and had likely never once heard the story of what had happened to a rancher named Boone Larkin 7 years before her husband ever mentioned it to her, if he had mentioned it at all. "Mr. Larkin," she said. "Thank you. Truly, you've no idea what that debt would have cost me." "I have some idea," Boone thought, and said nothing, and helped her carry the bucket the last quarter-mile to her gate, walking beside his horse in a silence that was, against every expectation he'd brought into town with him, almost comfortable. What Boone did not know, walking beside his horse toward the Hargrove gate that afternoon, was that Abigail Hargrove had spent the last 4 months conducting a quiet reckoning of her own one that had very little to do with debts owed to merchants and magistrates, and a great deal to do with the debt she felt she owed herself. She had married Elias Hargrove at 23, in a Dakota Territory church with her father's blessing and her own considerable doubts. Doubts she had told almost no one about, because a woman who voiced doubts about a good match was, in her mother's careful phrasing, a woman inviting trouble to sit down at her table. Elias had been kind, steady, hard-working, and visibly haunted by something he would not name. She had noticed that haunted quality on their very first meeting, a shadow that crossed his face at odd moments. Usually when talk turned to cattle, or courtrooms, or old friends from a life he'd left behind in the Bannock country. She had told herself, in the confident manner of the young, that love would eventually talk him into naming it. It had not. 3 years into their marriage, Elias Hargrove remained, in the one corner of himself that mattered most, a stranger to his own wife, polite, affectionate, entirely present for every ordinary demand of ranch life, and utterly closed on the subject of whatever had happened to him before she'd known him. When he'd finally ridden south in March, saying only that there was old business he needed to settle, Abigail had felt, beneath her worry for his safety, something almost like relief. At last, whatever this is, he's going to face it. She had not expected to spend the following 4 months fighting off a debt collector's slow siege virtually alone. She had not expected a stranger with a killer's reputation and a gentle, careful way with a stuck-well rope to be the one who taught her, gradually, that a man's worst chapter did not have to be his whole book. And she had certainly not expected, watching Boone Larkin sit at her kitchen table answering her nephew's blunt question about good guys and bad guys, with an honesty most grown men reserved for nothing at all, to find herself thinking quietly, guiltily, in the part of her mind she did not examine too closely, that whatever haunted quality had first drawn her to Elias Hargrove seemed to live, in a rawer and more visible form, in this stranger's face as well, and that she was beginning to suspect the two hauntings were, somehow, tangled together at the root. She did not yet have the words for what she suspected, but the suspicion sat with her, quiet and persistent, through every evening that followed, waiting for the moment it would finally be confirmed. Hargrove Crossing was, Boone had to admit, as they came over the last rise, a beautiful piece of ground, 40,000 acres of rolling grass cut through by a clear creek, with a low ridge of cottonwoods marking the water line, and a modest but well-built ranch house sitting square in the middle of it all, smoke curling thin from its chimney into the afternoon sky. It was the kind of place a man built when he intended to grow old on it, when he had stopped running from anything and started, instead, planting things that would take years to bear fruit. Boone stood at the gate a long moment, the bucket still in his hand, looking at it, and felt the old fury stir in his chest like a banked coal finding fresh air. He built this while my ranch went to the bank. He built this while Ellen and Caleb went into the ground. "You're welcome to come in for coffee, Mr. Larkin," Abigail said, misreading his hesitation for simple frontier manners. "It's the least I can offer, given the circumstances." He almost said no. Every hardened, careful instinct he'd built over 7 years of solitary riding told him to hand her the bucket, tip his hat, and put Hargrove Crossing behind him, for good, to leave this debt paid and this door closed, and never again risk the particular danger of standing this close to anything that wore the name Hargrove. But there was a boy, he saw then, coming around the side of the barn at a dead run, no more than 5 or 6 years old, hair the same wheat gold as his mother's, shouting, "Ma! Did you get the bucket, Ma? Did the rope hold?" And something about the boy's easy, uncomplicated joy, about the particular pitch of a child's voice calling for his mother across an open yard, drove into Boone Larkin like a blade finding an old scar, and finding it had never quite healed. He had not been able, in 7 years. To hear a boy's voice call out like that, without his mind, going straight to Caleb, 3 years old, chasing barn cats, gone now these 7 years into a grave Boone had not even been free to stand beside, when they lowered him into it. "Name's Tommy," Abigail said, watching the boy skid to a stop a few feet from the stranger, and study him with the frank, unguarded curiosity children reserve for anyone new and interesting. "He's my sister's boy, come to stay with us while she recovers from a hard birthing over in Dakota. Elias and I have no children of our own yet." Something crossed her face, quick and private, gone before Boone could read it fully. "We'd hoped to, before he left." He left. Boone filed that detail away the same way he filed away most things these days, quietly, without letting his face show what he'd noticed, and let himself be led, against every instinct that had kept him alive on the frontier for 7 hard years, into the kitchen of the man he had promised himself he would hate until the day he died. The coffee was good. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread, and had the particular unhurried order of a home that someone tended with real care, even in hardship, and Boone Larkin sat at the enemy's table, in the enemy's chair, drinking the enemy's wife's coffee, and felt, for the first time in 7 years, something dangerously close to peace right up until Tommy, climbing uninvited into the chair beside him, asked, with the fearless directness only a small boy can manage, "Mister, are you a good guy or a bad guy? You look like both." Boone did not have an answer for that. He was still searching for one 3 hours later, riding back up into the foothills alone, the question following him into the dark like a shadow that had learned to walk on its own. Boone did not intend to return to Hargrove Crossing again. He told himself this with considerably less conviction than he had the first time, and it lasted him exactly 6 days before he found himself, once more, riding down toward that low ridge of cottonwoods. This time with no excuse at all, no bucket to fix, no debt to settle, nothing but the plain, unadorned fact that some part of him wanted to see whether Tommy's question had an answer yet, and whether Abigail Hargrove's kitchen was as warm the second time as it had been the first. It was on this visit, the two of them sitting on the porch steps while Tommy chased a barn cat with the same delighted futility Caleb once had, that Abigail mentioned. In the easy way people mention things they've stopped finding painful to say aloud, that Elias had left in March to ride south, toward the Bannock country, chasing down what he'd called old business he should have settled years ago. Boone went very still. Bannock country, he repeated. He wouldn't say more than that, Abigail said, only that there was a wrong he'd let stand too long, and a man he needed to find, and that he couldn't rest easy building this ranch up while it stood unfixed. He said. She paused, frowning slightly at the memory. He said something odd, actually. He said, "A man can't build a house on ground he stole, Abby, not even by accident." I never fully understood what he meant by it. Boone understood it perfectly, and the understanding hit him like cold water down the back of his shirt. He said nothing, because there was nothing yet he trusted himself to say, and instead let Abigail talk, filling the quiet the way people do when a listener sits still and doesn't rush them, until, an hour later, helping her carry firewood in for the evening. He saw at a corner of yellowed paper, half burned, caught behind the wood stove where it had evidently slipped and been forgotten, saved from the fire by accident rather than intention. He should not have picked it up. He knew that even as his fingers closed around it. But something about the handwriting cramped, urgent, unmistakably Elias Hargrove's. A hand Boone remembered from years of shared cattle tallies and borrowed tool ledgers pulled his eyes to it before his better judgment could stop them. Cannot live with what I said in that courtroom. I told myself for years it was a mistake, a trick of distance and moonlight, that I truly believed I'd seen him. But I know now I saw a different rider, entirely Coy Vestal's man, riding a horse near enough to Boone's that a frightened jury and a grieving town were glad enough to believe what I told them, because it gave them a name to hang their fear on and let the real thieves ride free. I was afraid, Abby, afraid that if I said I wasn't certain, Vestal's men would come for us next, the way they'd come for Dunmore. I let a good man lose everything rather than risk what we had. I have prayed on it 7 years, and the praying has done nothing but show me my own cowardice more clearly. I mean to find him if he lives, and Vestal too if I must, and set the record straight even if it costs. The letter ended there, burned away, the rest lost to whatever fire had half consumed it. But it was enough, more than enough, to take the ground out from under Boone Larkin's feet as surely as if it had opened up beneath him. He knew. He's known for years. And he went looking to fix it. Boone stood there in the gathering dusk of the Hargrove kitchen, a half-burned letter shaking very slightly in his hand, and felt 7 years of carefully maintained hatred crack straight down the middle. He almost told her. Standing there with the letter in his hand, Boone Larkin came closer than he ever had before, in 7 years of nursing this particular wound, to laying the whole truth out on a kitchen table and letting it fall where it would. Your husband ruined my life with a lie, Abigail. He knew it. He spent years knowing it. I am the man he's out there right now trying to find, to make right, and I am standing in your kitchen. And I have already decided things about you and about him that this letter has just proven wrong. And I do not know what to do with any of it. But he looked at her, at the tired, hopeful, unguarded face of a woman who had spent 4 months alone, keeping a ranch running and a nephew fed and a debt collector at bay on. Nothing but stubbornness and the belief that her husband would come home, and everything would be right again, and he could not bring himself to hand her one more burden before she'd had the chance to see whether her husband's mission succeeded. So he folded the letter, quietly, and set it on the table where it might plausibly have simply fallen from wherever it had been tucked away, and said only, You should keep better care of your husband's letters. Mrs. Hargrove Fire nearly had this one. She thanked him, tucked it into her apron pocket without reading past the first line. Grief-worn people often cannot bear to reread the letters that hurt them, even when they cannot bear to burn them either, and the moment passed, and Boone rode home that night, carrying a secret so large it felt, physically, like a stone lodged somewhere behind his ribs. He did not sleep. He sat at his cold camp, the same one he'd sat at 11 nights before, and turned the whole shape of his life over in the dark, examining it from every angle he could stand to look at. 7 years, he had told himself a single, simple story: Elias Hargrove betrayed me, and I have every right to hate him for it until I die. It was a story that had gotten him through some very dark years. It had given his grief a shape, a direction, somewhere to point itself besides straight back at his own helplessness. And now, in the space of one burned letter, that story had gained a second half. He had never let himself imagine a man who had lied out of fear, yes, cowardice, yes, but who had also spent 7 years unable to live with what that lie had cost, who had left a wife and a home and a nephew he plainly loved to go chasing down the truth, at real risk to himself, because he could not, in the end, build a life on ground he knew he'd stolen. It did not undo what had happened. Ellen was still dead. Caleb was still dead. Boone's ranch was still gone. His 8 months in that cell still lived in his bones the way cold lives in old injuries, aching before storms. Forgiveness, if that was even the word for what was working its way up through him, was not going to hand any of that back. But hatred, he was beginning to understand, sitting alone under a wide, cold sky, with a fire he still had not bothered to light, had been the one thing standing between him and admitting how much he had actually liked Elias Hargrove, once, before all of it, and how much some small, stubborn, unkillable part of him still wanted, more than he wanted almost anything else in this world, for that old friendship to have meant what it had felt like it meant, before a courtroom in Bannock turned it into a lie. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of small, unremarkable afternoon that people rarely remember correctly afterward, precisely because nothing about it seemed, at the time, worth remembering. Boone had come to mend a section of fence along the north pasture, a task Abigail had mentioned only in passing, and which he had shown up 2 days later to handle without being asked twice, the way he had begun, without quite noticing himself doing it, to simply appear whenever Hargrove Crossing had a task that wanted doing, and no man's hands free to do it. Tommy trailed him the entire afternoon, the way small boys trail any adult who will tolerate their questions, and somewhere between the third and fourth fence post, he circled back, unprompted, to the question he'd asked weeks before. "You never told me," Tommy said, holding a fistful of nails with the fierce concentration of a boy who has been entrusted with an important job. Good guy or bad guy? Boone considered the question for longer than he had the first time, setting down his hammer, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of one forearm, looking out over the pasture gone gold with late summer. "I think," he said finally, "there's more men in this world who are both than there are men who are only one or the other, Tommy. I've done bad things, real bad things, some of them things I can't take back no matter how sorry I get for having done them. But I've also spent a good long while now trying to do right by folks who deserve better than what the world's handed them. Your aunt, for one. You, for another." He crouched down to the boy's height, meeting his eyes the serious way he'd have met a grown man's. "I reckon the honest answer is, I used to be mostly bad guy, with a little good guy left over. And I'm working real hard, most days, on flipping that around." Tommy considered this with the grave, unhurried attention children bring to answers that actually satisfy them. "My pa says everybody's got both in 'em," he said finally. He says the trick is choosing the good one enough times that it starts to stick. Boone went very still at that, because it was, almost word for word, something Elias Hargrove had said to him once, years before, sitting on a porch 2 valleys south of here, 2 young ranchers with their whole lives still ahead of them, talking about nothing in particular the way men do when the talking itself is the point. He had forgotten he'd ever heard it. He had not forgotten, he realized now, a single word. "Your pa," Boone said, his voice rougher than he intended, "sounds like a wise man." "He's the best man I know," Tommy said, with the simple, unshakable certainty of a child who has never once had reason to doubt it, and went back to holding out nails, and never noticed that the big stranger beside him had gone quiet for the rest of the afternoon, turning something over in his chest that felt, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, less like grief than like the slow, uncertain beginning of hope. If Boone had hoped that settling the mercantile account would put an end to Abigail Hargrove's troubles, he was disabused of that notion on his 3rd visit to Hargrove Crossing, when he rode down over the ridge to find Silas Crenshaw's buggy already sitting in the yard, and Crenshaw himself standing on the porch with a sheaf of papers in one hand and the particular satisfied posture of a man who believes he holds every card in the game. "Mrs. Hargrove," Crenshaw was saying, as Boone reined up a discreet distance off, close enough to hear, "I am not a man who enjoys unpleasantness, but business is business." The mercantile debt was, as I understand, generously settled by some passing benefactor I won't pry into who, but that was never the whole of the matter, was it? "I don't know what you mean," Abigail said, and Boone could hear, even from the yard, the careful control in her voice, the sound of a woman bracing herself for a blow she suspects is coming. "Your husband," Crenshaw said, consulting his papers with theatrical care, "took a loan against this property 2 years ago to purchase breeding stock. $400 at 8%, due in full this coming November, or renewable at the lender's sole discretion." He looked up. "I hold that note, Mrs. Hargrove. Purchased it from the Bannock Bank some months back, as it happens, at a very reasonable discount. Bankers do so dislike carrying paper on absent men." Boone felt something cold settle into his stomach. There it is. The $3 mercantile debt had never been the real threat. It had been a test, a probe, a way of measuring how much pressure this woman could bear alone, while the real weapon, $400 and a due date, waited patiently in Crenshaw's desk drawer for the moment it would do the most damage. "Elias will be home before November," Abigail said. "He'll settle it himself." "I do hope so," Crenshaw said, in a tone that made abundantly clear he hoped nothing of the kind, but 4 months' silence from a man who left no word of his whereabouts does tend to concern a careful lender. "Mrs. Hargrove, I would be remiss not to mention that should the note come due unpaid, my only recourse, regrettably, would be to call it in against the property itself. 40,000 acres of good grass and better water is, I am told, worth considerably more than $400. I would, of course, be prepared to make you a fair offer for the land, should it come to that, rather than see you lose it to a forced sale at auction, where you'd fetch far less." There it was, laid bare, the water rights he'd wanted for 2 years. The ranch he'd coveted since before Elias Hargrove had ever built the first fence post, arriving now by the patient, bloodless mechanism of a note quietly purchased and a due date quietly waited out. Boone sat his horse in the yard, unnoticed by Crenshaw, watching Abigail's straight back and her white knuckles gripping the porch rail, and felt something shift and settle inside him, the last uncertain piece of a decision he had not fully realized, until that exact moment, that he had already made. He was not going to ride away from this. Whatever Elias Hargrove had done to him 7 years ago, in a courtroom in Bannock, this woman had done nothing but marry a man, work a ranch, and stand her ground against a wolf, dressed in a magistrate's watch chain. And Boone Larkin, killer, outlaw in 3 territories, a man who had told himself for 7 years that he had no more mercy left to spend on anyone, discovered, watching her, that this particular debt was one he intended to see settled in full, whatever it cost him to do it. It is worth pausing here to say something about how a small town like Redemption Creek actually changes its collective mind about a man, because it rarely happens the way the stories tell it in one dramatic moment, one heroic act witnessed by the whole town at once. It happens, instead, in small accumulating increments, most of them witnessed by almost nobody, reported secondhand. Softened or sharpened, depending on who's doing the telling. It happened for Boone Larkin somewhere in the gap between his 2nd and 3rd visits to Hargrove Crossing, when Zeb Turlow, at the livery, mentioned, to whoever would listen, that the stranger had paid a full week in advance for his horse's boarding without being asked, and had spent an idle hour one afternoon, unprompted, helping Zeb's arthritic old hostler reshoe a cantankerous mule that had thrown 2 other men clean off their feet trying. It happened again when Mrs. Abernathy, sweeping her porch, watched the stranger tip his hat to her with unhurried courtesy on his way past, and mentioned to her husband that evening that whatever else people said about him, he had manners a good deal more careful than half the so-called gentlemen in this town. It happened a 3rd time when the Reverend, calling at Hargrove Crossing on a pastoral visit, found the stranger up on the roof mending a leak Elias had never gotten around to before he left, and came away remarking, with the particular surprise of a man whose profession trains him to expect the worst of everyone, that he had rarely met a man so quick to help and so slow to speak of it. None of these small moments, on their own, would have been enough to undo 7 years of a fearsome reputation carried across 3 territories. But small moments accumulate the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a river invisible, day to day, until one morning you look and the whole bed of the river has shifted. By the time of the town meeting, Redemption Creek had already, without any single resident quite realizing it had happened, stopped thinking of Boone Larkin as a stranger with a killer's face, and started thinking of him, instead, as that fellow, who's been helping the Hargrove woman, a considerably smaller and more forgivable category of man. It is a useful thing to remember, watching this story unfold, reputations, however fearsome, are rarely as fixed as the men who carry them believe them to be. They are built, generally, out of 100 small, unwitnessed choices, and they can be rebuilt the very same way, one small, unwitnessed choice at a time, patiently, without any particular hope of credit. Simply because it is the right thing to do, and a man has finally run out of reasons not to do it. Crenshaw's buggy had not been gone 20 minutes before Boone dismounted, walked up onto the porch, and said, without preamble, "I know men who've dealt with debt sharks like Crenshaw before. There are ways to fight a note like that besides waiting on a man who might not come home in time." Abigail turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw something other than exhaustion and stubborn dignity in her face. He saw suspicion, sharp and sudden. The reasonable suspicion of a woman who has just watched one predator leave her porch and is not entirely sure the man standing on it now isn't a different flavor of the same animal. "Mr. Larkin," she said carefully, "you've done me a kindness I can't repay, and I'm grateful for it. But I don't know you. I don't know why a stranger rides 40 miles twice in 2 weeks to fix my well and drink my coffee, and now offers to fight my legal battles besides. Most men don't do that without wanting something in return." It was a fair question, and Boone, standing on that porch, understood that he had reached the edge of what silence could cover for him. He could not tell her everything, not yet, not with Elias still out there somewhere, not with a burned letter's worth of truth still unconfirmed and unclaimed, but he could not, in good conscience, let her go on trusting a man she believed to be a stranger with no history to him at all. I knew your husband, he said finally. Years back, before you married him. We were neighbors, in the Bannock country. Something happened between us, a bad thing, a costly thing, and I came into this territory a stranger to nearly everyone in it, because it's easier to live as a stranger than to live as a man carrying what I carry. He met her eyes, steady, the way he'd learned to meet the eyes of men across a gun barrel, because it was, in its own way, no less dangerous a thing to do. I'm not going to lie to you about who I am, Mrs. Hargrove. I've killed men, 4 of them. Bounty work. Every one with paper on his head and blood already on his hands before I ever crossed his trail. I'm not proud of the life I've lived these 7 years, but I've never lied about it. And I won't start with you. I paid your mercantile debt because I saw a woman being humiliated by a man who had no right to humiliate her, and something in me couldn't ride past it. That's the whole truth, near as I can give it to you. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Boone half expected her to order him off her land. Instead, Abigail studied him for a long moment, really studied him. The way a person studies a ledger they suspect doesn't balance, looking for the place where the numbers don't quite add up, and then said, quietly, "You said something happened between you and Elias. Bad, costly." Her eyes narrowed slightly. Is that why he left in March? Old business he needed to settle? Boone did not answer that directly, because he was not yet ready to. But something in his face must have told her enough, because she nodded slowly, as if a piece of a much larger puzzle had just slid, however incompletely, into place. Whatever it was, she said finally, you came back to help me anyway. Twice. That has to count for something, Mr. Larkin, perhaps for more than you're willing to say tonight. She held out her hand, in the plain, businesslike manner of a woman closing a deal rather than sealing a friendship, though it was, in its way, both. Help me save this ranch, and we'll settle the rest of it, whatever the rest of it is, when Elias comes home to answer for it himself. Boone shook her hand and felt, for the first time in 7 years, like a man who had finally found something worth building instead of something worth burning down. What followed over the next 3 weeks was not a fight of the kind Redemption Creek was accustomed to seeing settled. No drawn pistols, no midnight raids, nothing that would have satisfied the appetite of a dime novelist looking for gunsmoke. It was, instead, a quieter and in some ways more grueling contest, fought with ledgers, letters, and the patient, unglamorous work of 2 people determined not to let a predator win simply because he wore a watch chain and called himself a judge. Boone, it turned out, had spent enough years drifting through territorial courthouses collecting bounty payments to have learned more about the mechanics of frontier law than he'd ever expected to put to use. He knew, for one thing, that a debt note purchased at discount from a distressed bank was still bound by the terms under which it had originally been written, and Elias Hargrove's original loan, Boone discovered after 3 days of careful searching through the county recorder's office in the territorial seat, 2 days' ride south, had specified a 90-day grace period following the borrower's documented absence due to travel, illness, or circumstance beyond reasonable control before any default could be legally declared. Crenshaw, in his hurry to press his advantage, had conveniently forgotten to mention that clause. Abigail, for her part, proved to have a mind for numbers that would have shamed half the bankers in the territory. Working from the ranch's own account books, she assembled a careful record wool sales pending, cattle ready for the fall drive. Every asset the ranch held that could plausibly be converted to cash before the note's true deadline, building a case, not that the debt shouldn't be paid, but that it could be paid, in full, on the ranch's own terms, without Crenshaw's forced auction and without Crenshaw's convenient timeline. He's not counting on us fighting back with evidence, Boone told her one evening, the 2 of them bent together over her kitchen table, papers spread between them, Tommy long asleep in the next room. Men like Crenshaw count on grief and fear doing their work for them. Nobody argues with a man holding a note when they're too tired and too scared to check whether his numbers are honest. And are they? Honest? Boone shook his head slowly, sliding a page toward her, a comparison, painstakingly assembled, of the interest rate Crenshaw was claiming against the rate actually specified in the original loan documents. He's added 2% nobody agreed to. Small enough that most folks wouldn't catch it. Large enough, compounded over 2 years, to matter considerably at settlement. There was also, quietly and separately, the matter of testimony, because Boone had learned, in his 3 days at the Territorial Recorder's office, one more thing worth knowing. He was not the only man in the territory who had reason to distrust Silas Crenshaw's business practices. 2 other ranching families, in towns a half-day's ride in either direction, had lost land to notes Crenshaw had purchased and called in with what looked, on paper, like suspiciously similar timing to disputes over water and grazing rights. It was not proof of wrongdoing, not on its own. But it was a pattern, and patterns, presented publicly and at the right moment, had a way of turning a self-appointed magistrate's confidence into something considerably less steady. A town meeting, Abigail said, when Boone laid it all out for her. Public, where he can't simply wave his watch chain and change the subject. A town meeting, Boone agreed, where every family he's leaned on gets a chance to speak, all on the same afternoon, where Crenshaw can't manage them one at a time behind closed doors the way he's used to. He looked at her across the papers, something that might almost have been a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth for the first time since he'd ridden into Redemption Creek. It's not a gunfight, Mrs. Hargrove, but I promise you, it'll do more damage to a man like Crenshaw than a bullet ever could. The 3 days Boone spent in the Territorial Recorder's office, 2 days' ride south of Redemption Creek, deserve a fuller telling than a single sentence can give them, because it was there, bent over dusty ledgers in a cramped back room that smelled of ink and mouse droppings, that Boone Larkin discovered something about himself he had not expected to find, that the same patient, methodical attention he had once brought to tracking wanted men across open. Country could be turned, just as effectively, toward tracking down the truth buried in a column of figures. The clerk on duty, a stooped, nearsighted man named Obadiah Fenn, who had kept these records for 11 years, and took a quiet pride in the fact that nobody ever bothered to check his work, was at first reluctant to let a stranger paw through years of loan documentation. But $3 the same sum, Boone noted with a private, grim sort of humor that had started this whole chain of events, bought Fenn's cooperation and, more usefully, his memory, which turned out to be considerably sharper than his eyesight. Crenshaw, Fenn said, chewing the word over along with a plug of tobacco, buys up a lot of paper. More than a man his size ought to have the capital for, you ask me, which I notice most folks don't. He squinted at Boone over his spectacles. You ain't the first to come asking about him this year. Fella from over Miles City Way came through in the spring, asking near identical questions. Never did find out if he got satisfaction. It took Boone the better part of a day to piece together, from scattered filings and half-legible margin notes, the pattern that would prove decisive 3 weeks later in that crowded church hall. 3 notes, purchased by Crenshaw within 18 months of each other, each one attached to a property bordering land Crenshaw already held or coveted. Each one called in within suspicious proximity to a season when water rights would matter most. It was not, on its own, damning. Coincidence could explain a single instance, even 2. But 3, laid side by side with careful dates and careful figures, began to look considerably less like coincidence and considerably more like a method, a slow, patient, legal-looking method for turning other men's hardship into his own expanding acreage, one technically defensible foreclosure at a time. Boone copied every figure by hand into a notebook he'd bought for the purpose, working late into candlelight both nights, because he understood with the same clear-eyed instinct that had once told him which trails a wanted man was likely to run, and which he was likely to avoid, that a case built on careful numbers, presented calmly and completely, would do more lasting damage to a man like Crenshaw than any accusation shouted in anger ever could. Anger Crenshaw could weather. He had weathered it before, from every family he'd ever squeezed. Arithmetic, laid out plainly enough that a whole room full of neighbors could follow it themselves without needing to take anyone's word for it, was a different matter entirely. He rode back north to Redemption Creek with the notebook wrapped in oilcloth against the weather, and delivered it to Abigail's kitchen table 2 days later with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who has, for the first time in longer than he can remember, used his considerable talent for finding things out in service of building something instead of ending it. The town hall in Redemption Creek was not, strictly speaking, a hall at all. It was the largest room in the church, borrowed for the occasion with the Reverend's blessing, its pews rearranged into a rough half-circle that filled to standing room within 20 minutes of the appointed hour. Word of a public reckoning with Silas Crenshaw had traveled the way all the best gossip travels, which is to say faster than seemed physically possible, and by the time Boone Larkin stood up at the front of that crowded room, he found himself looking out at nearly every family in the county, along with 2 ranching families who had ridden in from neighboring towns at Abigail's quiet invitation, carrying their own carefully assembled ledgers. Crenshaw arrived late, as men accustomed to being waited for often do, and found, to his visible and mounting discomfort, that the room had not been arranged the way rooms were usually arranged for him, with himself at the center of attention and everyone else arrayed as supplicants. Instead, he found himself one voice among many, in a room where 3 separate families were prepared to lay out, in careful and specific detail, notes he had purchased, terms he had quietly altered, and deadlines he had timed with what looked, laid side by side, uncomfortably like deliberate cruelty rather than coincidence. Boone did not speak much that evening. He had told Abigail beforehand that this needed to be her fight, told in her own voice, and that his part was only to make sure the numbers were there to back her up when she needed them. But when Crenshaw, cornered and reddening, tried his final gambit, turning to the room and declaring, with theatrical outrage, "And who exactly is standing behind Mrs. Hargrove tonight, doing her arithmetic for her? A stranger nobody in this town can even name. I'd remind you all that a wanted man's word is hardly the foundation you want to build a legal dispute upon." Boone stood, and the room went very quiet, and he said, simply, "My name is Boone Larkin. I've killed 4 men in this territory, every one of them under paper posted by lawful marshals for crimes they'd already committed. I've never once lied about who I am or what I've done, which is more, Mr. Crenshaw, than I can say for the interest rate on Elias Hargrove's note, or the timing of the 2 other notes you've called in this year against families who happen to be sitting on water you wanted." He let that settle a moment, meeting Crenshaw's eyes the way he'd once met the eyes of men across a gun barrel. "You've built a reputation in this county on being a man nobody dares question, because everybody's too polite, or too scared, or too tired to check your numbers. I checked your numbers, Mr. Crenshaw. They don't balance. And I expect, once the rest of this room finishes checking them too, you're going to find yourself considerably less busy around here than you're used to being." Before that, though, the room had heard from others too, because Boone and Abigail had been careful, in the weeks of preparation, not to make the evening about a single family's grievance, understanding that a magistrate practiced at deflection could far more easily dismiss one aggrieved widow than he could dismiss a pattern laid out by 6 independent voices. There was the Fenwick family, from a small holding 2 valleys east, whose patriarch, a quiet, weathered man named Ansel Fenwick, stood and described in halting but precise detail how a note Crenshaw had, purchased on their land 2 winters back, had been called due 3 weeks, after Fenwick refused to sell Crenshaw a right-of-way across his northern acreage, a refusal that had cost the family the northern 40 acres. At what Fenwick, consulting a small notebook of his own, called considerably less than half of fair value, by any honest reckoning. There was Ruth Calloway, a widow from the settlement's eastern edge, who spoke more briefly, her voice shaking with an anger she had clearly been saving up for some time. Describing how Crenshaw had visited her the week after her husband's funeral to discuss the matter of outstanding obligations, a visit, she said, had left her in no doubt that grief was, to a man like Crenshaw, simply another kind of vulnerability to be worked. And there was Obadiah Fenn himself, the recorder's clerk, who had ridden 2 full days north at Boone's quiet invitation, carrying with him certified copies of the original loan documents, proof, plain and undeniable, laid out on paper with the county's own seal upon it, that the terms Crenshaw had been enforcing bore only a passing resemblance to the terms actually agreed to. Crenshaw fought back, of course, as cornered men do. He accused the Fenwicks of simple buyer's remorse. He suggested that Ruth Calloway's grief had clouded her memory of their conversation. He tried, more than once, to steer the room back toward the comfortable old current of deference it had always shown him, reminding the assembled families of favors done, patience extended, hardship overlooked in years past, and for a moment or two, watching faces in the crowd soften slightly at these reminders. Boone worried the tide might yet turn back in Crenshaw's favor, the way tides in small towns so often did for men who had held power there long enough to be mistaken for a fixture of the landscape itself. It was Abigail, in the end, who delivered the evening's final and most decisive blow, not with anger, which the room had already grown somewhat accustomed to hearing from Crenshaw's other accusers, but with a plain, unhurried recitation of numbers that left no room for sentiment to muddy the accounting. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and read aloud, in a voice that did not once waver, the exact figures from her own ranch ledger set against the exact figures from Crenshaw's, claimed note the same comparison Boone had helped her assemble weeks before at her own kitchen table, and when she finished, she looked directly at Crenshaw and said, simply, "I am not asking this room to take my word over yours, Mr. Crenshaw. I am asking them to take the arithmetic over your word. Numbers don't hold a grudge, and they don't play favorites. Yours don't balance, mine do. Let the room decide for itself which of us they trust to have told the truth. It was not a gunfight. Nobody drew a weapon, nobody raised a fist. But there is a particular kind of defeat that settles over a man in a room full of neighbors who have just watched his authority dismantled piece by piece with nothing but arithmetic and patience, and Silas Crenshaw wore that defeat plainly as he gathered his papers, 20 minutes later, and left the church to a silence considerably heavier than the one that had greeted him. The following week, under pressure from a hastily convened territorial review prompted, in no small part, by 3 ranching families filing a joint complaint with the district court, Crenshaw agreed to reissue the Hargrove note at its original, correctly calculated terms, with the full 90-day grace period honored, and to submit his other outstanding accounts to an independent audit. It was not justice in any dramatic sense, but it was enough. It was, Boone reflected, riding back toward Hargrove Crossing beside Abigail's wagon under a sky gone soft with early evening, exactly the kind of victory that left everyone still standing at the end of it, which was, he was coming to understand, worth considerably more than the kind he'd spent the last 7 years accustomed to. He came home on a gray morning in late October, 6 months after he'd ridden out, thinner than when he'd left and carrying a satchel of papers that would eventually mean almost as much to the territorial court as Boone's careful ledgers had meant to Redemption Creek's town, meeting sworn statements, gathered at real personal risk over half a year of careful, dangerous investigation. From 3 men willing to testify, at last, that the rustling ring responsible for Otis Dunmore's killing 7 years before had been run by a man named Coy Vestal, and that the rider seen fleeing the Dunmore spread that night had been one of Vestal's hands, mounted on a horse whose coloring, at distance and in poor light, had been mistaken for Boone Larkin's. Elias Hargrove rode into his own yard to find, standing on his own porch beside his own wife, the one man in the territory he had least expected and most hoped, in some deep and complicated corner of his heart, to see again. The 2 men stood looking at each other across the yard for a long moment, and Abigail, watching from the porch step, later said she had never in her life seen a silence carry so much weight. "I looked for you," Elias said finally, his voice rough with the dust of 6 months' hard travel. "Bannock, and before that, 3 towns south of it. I heard you'd gone north into Montana territory, but nobody could say where." "I wasn't hiding," Boone said. "Not from you, anyhow, just from everything else." "I have to tell you what I did," Elias said, and his voice cracked on it in a way that told Boone, more clearly than any letter could have, exactly how many nights this particular confession had been rehearsed and dreaded in equal measure. "I have to tell you what I said in that courtroom, and why, and I have to tell you that I have hated myself every single day for 7 years, for I read the letter," Boone said quietly, "the one that near burned up behind your wood stove. I've known for 2 months, Elias. I didn't tell your wife, because I figured that was a truth that belonged to you to give her, in your own time and your own words, not mine to hand her second-hand." Something in Elias Hargrove's face broke open at that not just relief, though there was relief in it, but something closer to disbelief, the particular stunned gratitude of a man who has spent 7 years bracing for a reckoning he felt he deserved, and has just been handed, instead, an unearned mercy he does not know how to hold. "Why?" Elias said. "Would you do that? Keep my secret, when you had every right to walk into my own house and tell my wife exactly what kind of man she married?" Boone thought about that question for a long moment, looking out over the ranch, the good grass, the clear creek, the cottonwoods turning gold with the season. A home built, he understood now, by a man who had never once stopped trying, in his own flawed and frightened and ultimately courageous way, to make right what he had broken. "Because you went looking for the truth even when it would have been easier to let it lie," Boone said finally. "Because your wife stood her ground against a man twice her size in power and never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I am. And because I spent 7 years telling myself that hating you was the only thing keeping me alive, and I've come to understand, these last few weeks, that it wasn't hate keeping me alive at all. It was the hope, underneath it, that I'd get a chance someday to find out the friend I lost wasn't as gone as I'd let myself believe." Elias Hargrove crossed the yard in 3 long strides and embraced him, and Boone Larkin, killer, outlaw, a man who had not let himself be embraced by anyone in 7 years, stood in his enemy's arms and wept, for the first time since he had buried his wife and son, without any shame at all. Elias Hargrove, 6 months away from home, deserved their own telling too, because the man who rode back into his own yard that gray October morning had traveled a road every bit as difficult, in its own way, as anything Boone had endured in his years of drifting. He had ridden first to Bannock, to the courthouse, where he'd told his lie under oath, and had spent 3 sleepless nights in a rented room above a saloon simply trying to work up the courage to begin asking questions that might, depending on the answers, end with him standing trial himself for perjury. He had found, eventually, an old marshal's deputy, retired now and running a feed store, who remembered the Dunmore killing well enough to recall a detail that had nagged at him for years, that the horse the witnesses described fleeing the scene had a distinctive white stocking on its off foreleg, a marking Boone's own horse, back in those days, had never carried. That single loose thread, pulled patiently over the following months, led Elias from the feed store to a retired freight hauler in Virginia City, who remembered selling just such a marked horse to one of Coy Vestal's men the year of the killing. From there, to a frightened, aging former hand of Vestal's own outfit, now farming quietly outside Dillon, who had spent 7 years terrified of what he'd witnessed and considerably more terrified of what would happen if he ever said so aloud, and finally, after months of careful, dangerous persuasion, to that same man's signed and witnessed statement, the cornerstone of the satchel of papers Elias would eventually carry home. It had cost him more than the 6 months. Coy Vestal, though scattered and diminished since his rustling operations heyday, still had friends in rough places. And Elias had twice found himself followed on lonely stretches of road by riders who asked no questions and offered no names, content, apparently, to let their silent presence do the threatening for them. He had not turned back. He told Abigail, much later, that the thought that kept him in the saddle through those frightened nights was not courage, exactly, but something plainer and more stubborn, the simple, exhausting refusal to let fear win a second time, the way it had won in that courtroom 7 years before. "I kept thinking," he told her, the two of them alone on the porch some weeks after his return, that I'd already let fear cost Boone everything once. I wasn't going to let it stop me from fixing it, whatever it cost me this time around. It had cost him considerably 6 months of his wife's worry, a debt collector's near-successful siege on his own land, and a journey that had aged him, Abigail privately thought, by considerably more than half a year's worth of lines around his eyes. But it had also given him back, at the end of it, the one thing he had genuinely not expected to recover. A friend he had believed for 7 years. He had no right to ever call by that name again. Elias Hargrove's sworn statements, carried south to the territorial court that winter, did what 7 years of Boone's own quiet endurance had never managed to do. They cleared his name, formally and permanently, striking the old rustling accusation from the territorial record, and in the process, quietly closing the book on Coy Vestal's operation, which unraveled within the year once its true leader could no longer hide behind another man's ruined reputation. Boone Larkin did not stay at Hargrove Crossing forever. That was never. He understood by then the shape this story was meant to take. Some debts, once paid, leave a man free to go rather than obligated to stay. And Boone had spent enough years running from a life he couldn't build that he needed, first, to learn how to build one on his own 2 feet before he tried building it alongside anyone else's. He rode out the following spring with Elias and Abigail's blessing, and their standing invitation, and a small herd of breeding stock Elias had insisted on gifting him not as payment. Both men agreed. Because some things aren't debts that can be settled with cattle, but as a beginning. He bought 40 acres 2 valleys over, modest ground with good water, and built, slowly, over the following years, a life that bore almost no resemblance to the one he'd carried in his chest for 7 bitter years on the trail, a life with neighbors instead of bounties, with a name that meant, increasingly, something other than trouble. He kept $1 silver back, the winter he settled that mercantile debt, unspent, the one with the notch filed into its edge, and he never fully explained, even to Abigail or Elias, exactly why. Perhaps it was superstition. Perhaps it was simply that some objects come to hold more weight than their metal accounts for, becoming a kind of private monument to the exact moment a man's life turned, however reluctantly, away from the darkness he'd been circling and back towards something worth building. He carried it in his vest pocket for the rest of his days, and family legend passed down through the Hargrove and Larkin lines for 3 generations until it reached a great-granddaughter who donated the coin, along with the mercantile's surviving ledger page, to a small county museum in the 1970s, held that he would take it out sometimes, of an evening, and turn it over in his fingers without ever quite explaining what he was thinking. The truth, which none of his descendants ever fully knew but which we can understand now having walked this whole road together, is simple enough to say plainly, that coin was never really worth $3. It was worth a friendship he'd believed lost forever. Restored, it was worth a hatred he'd carried for 7 years, finally allowed to set down. It was worth a woman's dignity, defended when the whole town had been prepared to let it be quietly sold off to a man with a watch chain and a bad debt. It was worth, in the end, the exact and precious thing that Boone Larkin had believed, riding into Redemption Creek that first dusty morning. He no longer had any capacity left to give. The choice offered freely to a stranger who happened to be his enemy's wife, to be merciful anyway. That is why a killer paid $3 to save his enemy's wife. Not because he was already a good man pretending, for a moment, at cruelty, and not because a single kindness transformed him overnight into someone he wasn't, but because somewhere underneath 7 years of grief and fury and hardened silence, the man Boone Larkin used to be the one who sang along badly when Ellen sang while she worked, the one who chased barn cats with his own small son, the one who had once, long ago, called Elias Hargrove friend and meant it had never actually died. It had only been waiting, patient as a coin at the bottom of a well, for someone to lower a rope down after it and haul it back up into the light. There is a small, hand-typed card that used to sit beside that glass case before the county museum modernized its displays in the 1990s and replaced it with a printed plaque. And the card, though it has long since been lost to some archive box nobody has opened in decades, was written by the museum's first curator, a woman named Constance Whitfield, in 1974, when the coin and ledger page were first donated by a Larkin descendant. Whitfield had done more digging than most curators bother to do for a single small-town artifact. She had corresponded, by mail, with historical societies in 3 counties, tracked down court records from a territorial perjury case that had been quietly dropped in 1877 in light of new evidence, and the defendants demonstrated good faith in bringing it forward, and located, in a dusty church record book, the baptismal notice for a child born to Boone Larkin and a second wife, a schoolteacher. From Virginia City, he married 4 years after the events of this story a boy they named Elias, after the friend whose reconciliation, Whitfield's notes speculated, seems to have marked the true turning point in Mr. Larkin's return to a settled and honorable life. Her original card, as best as later researchers could reconstruct it from a single surviving photograph of the old exhibit, reads simply, "This coin represents more than a debt paid. It represents the capacity of even a hardened man to choose mercy when given the chance, and reminds us that redemption, on the frontier as anywhere else, rarely arrives all at once. It arrives one small kindness at a time, until enough of them have accumulated to change a life." It is, all these years later, still the truest thing anyone ever wrote about that coin. If you visit that small county museum today, you can still see the coin and the ledger page beside it, and read the plaque that gets the story only half right, the way most old plaques do. But you'll know better now. You'll know it wasn't charity. It wasn't chance. It was a man who had every reason in the world to walk past a woman's suffering and let it be someone else's problem, choosing instead, in one unguarded moment, to be better than his own worst years had convinced him he was capable of being. That is the whole of the story, and I hope it stayed with you the way it stayed with me. If you want more stories like this one, true frontier history reshaped into the tales that never quite made it into the textbooks. Stories about the debts nobody can see and the mercy nobody expects, then this is exactly the kind of channel you want to be part of. Hit subscribe right now, tap that bell so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment below telling me what you think Boone did with that notched silver dollar in his final years. I read every single one. Thank you for riding all the way to Redemption Creek with me today. I'll see you on the next trail.